Welcome to Silicon Wafers, a new format video where we dive into stories in depth, stories that are important to understand what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Russia, and what is happening in the broader geopolitical perspective. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a recent exclusive interview between Luke Harding of The Guardian and General Syrskyi. This is the first interview that he has conducted with foreign media since taking over as head of the armed forces of Ukraine from General Zaluzhny, who has now become Ukraine's ambassador to the UK in London. This episode is being made available on Silicon Curtain to start with, but if you want to see more of these materials, please follow the link over to Silicon Wafers, where we'll be posting short, in-depth commentary videos. And the aim is to produce one of these on a daily basis, taking the best of Russian language journalism produced by Russians and Ukrainians and some of the best analysis and journalism that is appearing in Western media as well. We will also be conducting interviews with leading journalists about reporting from Ukraine and, of course, the increasing difficulties of reporting accurately from Russia as well. These will be different from the interviews that will continue to be published on Silicon Curtain. They'll be much shorter, punchier, but they will go in depth into particular issues which provide an important background into Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. So please, if you want to see more materials like this, make sure you subscribe to the new channel, Silicon Wafers. Well, let's jump into this article. I know we will win. And how, says General Syrskyi in this in-depth interview. He is currently Ukraine's top general, and he is charged with the mission of turning the tables on Russia and creating a situation of victory for Ukraine, or at the very least, put Ukraine in a far more advantageous and stronger position, potentially in the run-up to any negotiations that may take place later this year or next year. In this interview with Luke Harding that was published in The Guardian on Wednesday, 24th of July, General Oleksandr Syrskyi weighs Ukraine's recent setbacks, the counterstrikes, and the changing face of Europe's largest scale war since 1945. General Oleksandr Syrskyi was pressed about when F-16s would finally be appearing on the front, and he was incredibly tight-lipped about that. So no new details about the number of F-16s or indeed when they will first be seen in combat in the skies above Ukraine. General Syrskyi is Ukraine's new commander and has the unenviable task to win this war that is taking place on a tremendous scale against the larger Russian army. And this is one of the key points that he drew attention to in this interview. He seemed to be quite candid about the scale of the task. He acknowledged that Russians are better resourced. They have more of everything, he said: tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, soldiers. Their original 100,000 strong invasion force has grown considerably despite tremendous losses that are reported to be between 500 and 600,000 killed in action. They now have an army that is more than 5 times the size of the original invasion force, and it is estimated to be at the scale of about 520,000 currently on the territory of Ukraine. But Russia does seem to have a goal to grow this considerably. Syrskyi speculated that by the end of 2024, this could have grown to 690,000 men. The sizes of the Ukrainian forces have not been made public, the same as the scale of Ukrainian losses has not been revealed. Syrskyi said there's a ratio of 1:2 or 1:3 in favor of the Russians. Since 2022, the number of Russian tanks has doubled from 1,700 to 3,500. Artillery systems have tripled, and armored personnel carriers have gone up from 4,500 to 8,900. And he went into more details as well. Since last autumn, Ukraine's armed forces have been going steadily backwards. Of course, this is on a small incremental scale. The media tends to blow up the Ukrainian losses, sometimes in a way that is sensationalist and not particularly helpful. But one of the first acts performed by Syrskyi when he took over the job from Valery Zaluzhny was to order the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka after they had been dug in and fighting hard for many, many weeks and months in that position. That did, of course, help to attrit Russian forces, but the withdrawal from Avdiivka also placed a heavy toll on Ukraine. And that retreat from Avdiivka coincided with a 6-month gap in the supply of US weapons to Ukraine, which was cited at the time as an absolutely crucial factor in forcing Ukraine to move back. But the Russians, he said, are still seizing fields and villages in eastern Donbass, and they're using the air-dropped glide bombs to blast a path forward. And Syrskyi has admitted that things are very difficult. He says the Russian aggressor attacks our positions in many directions. And this comes hot on the heels of Russia's latest attempt to seize Kharkiv and the neighboring province of Sumy. That has failed, says Syrskyi, and Putin's attempt to create a so-called security corridor next to Russia's border in the Belgorod region has been thwarted. In fact, it's not mentioned in this article, but Putin recently declared Belgorod to be a sanitary zone. So rather than having the buffer on Ukrainian territory, this seems to have rebounded badly on Russia, and they are creating a kind of buffer on their own territory from Ukrainian counterattacks. But it's important also to note that Syrskyi says that Russia's gains are not strategic. He describes Russia's creeping victories as tactical ones. He calls them local gains rather than operational breakthroughs. The enemy has not made any significant progress, he said. The front line, he added, was 3,700 kilometers long. Active hostilities are taking place across 977 kilometers of it at any given time. That is twice the length of the border between Germany and France. And we have to recall here, again, this is not pointed out in the article, but it's an important fact to state that in that 6 to 8 months where Ukraine was starved of ammunition because of blockades in the US political system, and indeed the US government sitting on whole tranches of money that were approved to be used to support Ukraine, but nonetheless were not utilized. In that period, Russia made no significant gains. So we have to question that even though the gains it's making now are incremental, they do not seem to be absolutely war-winning or to have particular momentum behind them. And of course, the article points out that Russia's successes have come at a staggering human cost. It is estimated the Kremlin's casualties are 3 times higher than Ukraine's, and even higher in certain directions, Syrskyi is quoted as saying. The number of Russians killed, the ratio of Russians to Ukrainians killed, is actually much higher, he claims. And we do have one figure to work on, although it is certainly out of date. In February this year, Volodymyr Zelensky said that 31,000 Ukrainian service personnel have died since 2022. Whether that figure was accurate then, whether it's accurate now, is something, of course, we have to question. And of course, Syrskyi has, in this article, declined to talk about Ukrainian losses. He says this is a sensitive topic, and it is certainly one that Moscow could exploit. That is perfectly credible. Russia will use any such stories to try to wreck Ukraine's effort to mobilize its population, to continue fighting the aggression, and to try and destroy Ukrainian morale. Syrskyi has contrasted his battlefield tactics with those used by Russian commanders. Now, as we've seen from numerous videos of battles on the front, many of which, of course, are shared by Ukrainian forces, in a kind of warfare PR, Russians are known for sacrificing huge numbers of infantry troops to gain maybe just a couple of 100 meters of territory. Ukraine has not adopted those kind of tactics. Rather, it has been using defensive and attritional tactics that are very mindful of trying to preserve the lives of its people. And this is in stark contrast to Russia. Syrskyi says it's very important for us to save the lives of our soldiers. We won't defend ruins to the death. And this again is stark contrast to the Russians, who seem perfectly content to turn cities into rubbles and ash simply so they can rule over the ash piles. Syrskyi says that he and Ukraine's armed forces are not willing to achieve goals at any cost. Syrskyi has, however, noted some positive developments. F-16s, he certainly believes, are on their way, even though no specific date has been provided, and he says that these will strengthen Ukraine's air defenses. He's also given some interesting details about how they may be deployed. They may have to remain 40 or more kilometers from the front line because otherwise that risks Moscow shooting them down. And he's also said here that Russia has superior aviation and very strong air defenses. And of course, we have seen footage over the last couple of months of Ukraine trying to destroy Russian air defenses on the territory of Crimea and where it can on the territory of Russia, although we know there are some strict and, to an extent, nonsensical limitations placed on Ukraine about how far into Russian territory it is allowed to fire, with US weapons, certainly, but potentially the US has also put pressure on allies so that no international provided weapons can be used more than around 100 kilometers into the territory of Russia. That is extremely limiting in terms of a military strategy and in terms of Ukraine being able to defend itself from attack. However, Syrskyi has also talked positively here about the use of drones, and he has said that the Ukrainian army is using them very effectively and is also trying out robotic ground systems, that is, land robots that could deliver ammunition or rescue wounded soldiers. He's claimed that the Ukraine Armed Forces has set up a new unmanned systems command, the first of its kind in any Western military. This will allow us to fight not by quantity, but by quality, he said, adding that drones have played a significant role in the war, and this role is as significant as artillery. And we know that, of course, this has been an incredibly intensive artillery war where it is scale and accuracy that have really determined who gains the upper hand in many of the areas of the front line. And it's worth noting that Ukraine's armed forces have been highly successful at using long-range kamikaze drones to strike deep inside Russia. They have targeted around 200 critical infrastructure sites, Syrskyi is quoted as saying, and he pointedly comments that all of these were military and logistical targets associated with the military. That includes factories, fuel dumps, and munition depots. That is in stark contrast to what we see Russia hitting: hospitals, cultural sites, and so on. Ukraine has also pioneered the use of speedboat-like sea drones, and using these and other techniques has sunk about a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet, and judging by the news last week, has forced the remaining vessels completely out of the Azov Sea. Syrskyi comments on this, adding that the Kremlin has been forced to completely pull out from the Crimean port of Sevastopol after a series of Ukrainian attacks. And of course, the Ukrainian objective is to ultimately destroy the Kerch road and rail crossing that connects the occupied peninsula with Russia. Syrskyi pointed out how important that is, but declined to say when or how that might happen. But pressed on the question of Crimea, he did say that Kiev does have a plan to get it back. He also emphasized that it is realistic, but of course it's a big military secret, he said. However, we will do everything we can to reach the internationally recognized borders of 1991. And this is important because this very much aligns with what the majority of Ukrainian people want. They want a full and expansive victory that returns Ukraine to its sovereign territories. There are other aspects to victory as well, but the fundamental one on which perhaps every other definition of victory could rest includes a return to its legally recognized borders. Syrskyi is an interesting character. He's aged 58, was born in Vladimir, a city outside of Moscow in what was then the Soviet Union. It has been reported that his parents have disowned him and still live in that town in Russia. That is an extraordinary fact, which not that many people seem to be aware of. However, since the 1990s, he served in Ukraine's armed forces. But despite being one of the most senior military people and increasingly recognized since he took over from Zaluzhny, it does not protect him from some fierce criticism. There are some who accuse him of Soviet-style military thinking, but he does have supporters as well. One of those, importantly, seems to be President Zelensky, who has made him a hero of Ukraine after he was involved in leading the defense of Kiev following Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. There are more details in this article. We'll skip over those about Syrskyi's background, but it continues that one of his most pressing challenges is to find new recruits to replace Ukrainian soldiers who've been killed and injured. This is perhaps one of the most important topics, and it has been reported it's a topic that Zaluzhny did perhaps clash with Zelensky on. Zaluzhny famously has been trying to push for a much wider scale mobilization, really from 2023 at least, foreseeing that these kind of manpower problems would eventually arise. And indeed, that's where Ukraine seems to find itself now. The article states that people fighting in the trenches are exhausted. The men and the women who joined up to help defend Ukraine in the early days of the war have now been fighting for more than 2 years, sometimes in the most extraordinarily harsh and brutal conditions. Now, the government is trying to react to this. It has been accused of perhaps moving too slowly and inefficiently, and there have also been some accusations that their communications around mobilization have been incredibly poor. But the government recently reduced the conscription age from 27 to 25, and last week a new law came to effect that requires men to register their details electronically with military recruitment centers. Now, many people have done so. Many thousands have followed the law and registered their details, potentially to become part of this mobilization. There are, of course, many that are in hiding and have refused to do so. As many Ukrainians themselves point out to me, not everyone can be a soldier. Syrskyi, however, said that without mobilization, he cannot create new reserves and brigades. And it seems that as Russia multiplies its land forces, this is becoming increasingly critical for Ukraine. Syrskyi says it's very important for us that all citizens of Ukraine fulfill their constitutional duty, and he has urged Ukrainians living outside the country to take part as well. And he says here something that will resonate with anyone who studied history of the Second World War and how in Britain everyone had to play a part in order to help these islands survive against the Nazi onslaught in Europe. He says that I hope that after victory, Ukrainians will be able to tell their children where they were, and indeed ask themselves, where were you when all the other citizens of Ukraine were fighting in such fierce battles? Another initiative, however, has been launched in Poland, and that is to create a new legion of Ukrainians who are currently abroad, but which could sign up to help fight and defend Ukraine and get training in Poland as well in order to do that, scale up Ukraine's armed forces. This is a great initiative. We've talked about this a little bit in some of the Silicon Bytes episodes, and we will no doubt revisit it as that initiative starts to gain some traction. Now, according to Luke Harding, who wrote this article, he says that one senses that relationships between Zelensky and Syrskyi are harmonious, and speculates that perhaps this is helped by the fact that the commander seems to have no real political ambitions and, of course, has a much lower profile than Zaluzhny. And the article concludes by stating that Russia began its armed takeover of Ukraine in 2014. But that really scaled up in 2022. It went from being a covert war where Russia grabbed parts of the Donbass to the full-scale war where its ambition seemed to be to take the entire country and maybe more as well. And more than a decade on, it seems there's little likelihood of Europe's largest war since the Second World War ended in 1945. Little likelihood that that will finish this year or possibly even next, speculates Luke Harding. Can Ukraine win? And if so, when might that victory be? Syrskyi here says that you have to be an extremely brave or potentially even foolhardy person to actually put a date on that. However, he says that it is his mission and the mission of the Ukrainian armed forces to do everything within its power to make that victory happen. There is simply no more important task for us, says Syrskyi. Now, this is an important article. I think there's lots of important details here. And of course, Luke Harding has consistently, over many, many years, been one of the most hawkish / realistic commentators on what's happening in Russia during its authoritarian slide. And he has, over the last 2.5 years, been one of the most outstanding reporters on the territory of Ukraine as well. Let's give a quick summary of this article before we sign up. So the current situation is that Russia has around 520 to 530,000 service personnel. Russia also has a reserve component which consists of many more thousands. That is estimated to be 60 to 65,000. And this is far, far higher than the 100,000 odd soldiers that took part in the initial invasion. It has, of course, been suggested that Russia's forces with which it initially invaded Ukraine were far too small to achieve the strategic objectives that it seemed to lay out for itself. But by the end of 2024, the Russian military political leadership plans to increase its armed forces, potentially having most of those on the territory of Ukraine up to around 690,000, and to expand the reserve component to 100,000. This really represents a society that is turning into a mobilized and military society. The big question is going to be whether it carries on pulling in foreign fighters and people from the provinces, or whether it has to turn to its population in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, and so on, something which represents a tremendous risk for the regime. In order to achieve this, Russia will need potentially to conduct another mobilization, potentially calling up 250 to 300,000 new servicemen. That sounds like an extraordinary figure, but it is suggested that even at the moment, Russia is potentially calling up between 15 to 30,000. Certainly, there may be a gap between the figures that it claims it is mobilizing on a monthly basis and those which it is actually able to cull together, because we have seen the costs of an individual contract for a soldier rising really significantly over the last 2.5 years. That suggests a certain difficulty in recruiting people and a certain reluctance of people to join up to Vladimir Putin's genocidal war. It also suggests that people are not joining up for patriotic reasons. They are joining up to earn money out of killing and invading a neighboring territory. Well, aside from the immorality of that, it also suggests a certain difficulty on the part of the Moscow regime in maintaining an army at this scale. Implementing Russia's efforts to create a significantly large army will require vast resources and effort. Mobilization and further buildup of troops could be a major challenge for the Russian economy and society, which is already under tremendous strain. High troop numbers require constant replenishment of personnel due to significant losses, and we can only speculate about the inability to really train this number of troops to a high standard, especially given that many, many Russian soldiers have lost their lives. Many who may have had a high level of military training were actually lost in the first months of the war and in the siege of Kiev, which was an outright disaster for the Russian military. Currently, the Russian military is manned through a mixed approach, including volunteers, contract soldiers, and forcibly mobilized service people. However, even these methods do not always ensure the required numbers. As I say, there is almost certainly a major gap between how many soldiers Russia claims to have drafted into its armed forces and how many it may actually have done so. And of course, the quality of those troops is something that is highly questionable. And the level of losses of the Russian army remain consistently high because their actions are offensive. That is always going to incur higher losses than defensive actions. And of course, in the age of drone warfare, movements on the front, offensive movements on the front, are almost always visible to the enemy. So if Ukraine has the required artillery units and ammunition and drones and so on, then it's highly likely that Russia will continue to sustain extremely high losses based on the relatively primitive and simple tactics that it deploys here. To substantially increase the numbers of troops, it will be necessary to not only compensate for current losses, that is, pay the families for those losses, which again is a huge burden on the Russian economy and treasury, but also to continuously add new forces to their numbers to continue these extremely brutal and profligate tactics. These are all details, I think, which is important to understand, important background behind the article and what we may see unfold over the coming months. This is a fantastic article, however, from Luke Harding and the Guardian team. We'll be putting links to all the sources used in the creation of this episode in the links below. Also, please, now you've seen this, if you like this material, if you think it will be useful to see more of these materials on a daily basis, then please sign up, subscribe to the Silicon Wafers channel so you get alerts every time we publish a new video. Thank you for watching.